Well, welcome to our of PD activity in a series that we are intending to run for the training and assessment marketplace. Now, before I start, I would like to just go through one thing for you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Islanders peoples who are here today. Thank you all for attending. We have a lot of people that have registered to join, hundreds and hundreds. If you're here at the beginning and you're here until the end, then you will receive a statement of attendance. Now, that statement of attendance will be able to be used as part of your professional development activities. You should save that into your professional development file. Likewise, you should put in your professional development plan any future session that we run or anybody else that you wish to attend. That way you meet the requirements for professional development. Now, I want you to know, HBA is not here to sell you its services. We decided to do this as a service to the training and assessment industry. There is no cost, and anybody at all is free to join this particular session. In fact, we have people here from our competitors, and we welcome you. Now, given that you are trainers, the one thing we know about you is you're not shy, and you have the capacity to ask questions on the GoToMeeting window in your laptop and or screen right at the moment. So there's a little bubble. If you click on that, that opens up a discussion area for you. Now, we have people here today from every state of Australia, including the Northern Territory and the ACT territories. And we say good afternoon to you, but we also have people from overseas. So to you, we say good evening and or good morning. We had over 200 registrations in the first 24 hours of announcing this. I would like to pay special tribute to the major accounts which HBA has. Most of HBA's business is all about major accounts. We deal with some of the biggest organisations in the country, and I say hello to you. I won't name you, you know who you are. I have some of our more senior people at HBA here helping me today. Firstly, I have Mr. Tim Fitzgerald, who's our National Manager. He's in our Melbourne office at the moment running a course, but he's there to assist in any way that he can technically. I have both Julian and Neil here. They're our more senior TAE trainers. They're manning laptops, ready to answer any questions that you want to pose. And also driven by Carol Vo. Carol is our Learner Support Manager. She looks after our thousands of learners, and I'm not sure how she does everything that she does. But this is a team effort, not just me out the front. I guarantee you that this will be over no later than 5 p.m. It's scheduled to finish about 10 to 5 because it is Friday afternoon in Sydney time. Now, as a company, we've delivered the certificate in training and assessment since about 2004. And over the time, we've had tens of thousands of learners. When we originally became an RTO, we had TAA 401-104 on our scope. And we saw the dramatic changes when it was made into TAE 40110. Lots of things changed. They took out the vet environment unit. They took out the occupational health and safety unit, and they took out another unit which was about designing assessment tools. When it went from TAE 40110 to TAE 40116, we saw some dramatic changes there. They changed content because they added Assessment 502, Design and Develop Assessment Tools. They took it from the diploma and they put it into the certificate form. We saw them introduce the LLN unit as a core unit instead of being an elective as it historically was. But what's very interesting is we saw the change to frequent In many of the units, even ones that are deemed equivalent, if you had to do it twice before, you probably have to do it 3 times now. If you had to do it 3 times before, you might have to do it 5 times now. And we saw changes to the core units where there really is now only one elective unit left in TAE 40116. And when you look at the changes that have happened outside of the LLN unit, what we notice is the majority of those changes are in the assessment learning field. And now I ask myself, why do we think the regulators changed the assessment learning field or strengthened it? We know when TAE 40110 was on foot, there was about 838 RTOs licensed to deliver it. With TAE 40116, the last time I looked, there was about 113 RTOs. So we wonder, why did they change it? Well, I can tell you some horror stories, but no names. But very briefly, there were providers that were allowing people to complete the 40110 qualification over a weekend or just by signing documents. And the regulators said this wasn't right because the marketplace said, you know what? We are hiring trainers and assessors who are qualified, but they simply don't know enough about assessment. They don't know how to produce tools. They don't know how to conduct assessment. They don't understand the process properly. So what we found was the vet regulators very, very much firmed up the requirement for the qualification. It was very difficult to get on scope, and it's even more difficult to facilitate, I assure you. Given that the major changes occurred in assessment, I asked you a question. I asked you to think about this. What is assessment? We're talking about assessment. What is it? In your mind, just come up with some form of a definition that you think fits the word assessment in the vet context. Well, assessment is the collection of evidence to see whether competency has been achieved. That begs the second question, doesn't it? What then is evidence? We know what assessment is. It collects this stuff called evidence, but what is evidence? Have you thought of an answer yourself? Well, evidence legally is defined as something which can be detected by one or more of the senses which proves a point. So we know what assessment is, and we know what evidence is. So a question arises is, what is the requirements of assessment in vet? Well, before we dive into vocational education training, let's have a look and consider a court of law. Now, in a court of law, you must be represented, or you have the choice to say that you don't wish to be represented. You see, the court wants to make sure that it's fair as an assessment. So fairness must exist within a court of law. When you have a judge and or a jury who are hearing evidence, they can only consider the matter at hand. They might hear of things which are not quite right, but they cannot judge on those. They can only deliberate on things which fulfill the requirement of validity. Then we look at what can happen in a court. Well, you know, either side can ask for an adjournment at any point in time. That can be because they've got to collect more evidence, or because somebody is not available, or because they don't feel well. You see, here the court is practicing with the rule of flexibility. And both sides will submit evidence to the judge or the jury, and it's the judge or jury that actually will determine whether the evidence is right. Therefore, reliability comes into what they do. Now, you know, in a court of law, most courts of law, there is a mechanism of appeal. Does that sound familiar to those of you who do assessments? It's sure familiar to me. Now, as the prosecution and the plaintiff present their evidence, the court is, in the main, looking at two considerations. How has the evidence been presented? Has it been presented in a format and in a timely fashion which is consistent with the court processes? And secondly, they are considering, can the evidence be admitted or is it not? You see, the court may or may not believe a witness or admit the evidence because they might think it is not authentic. The court will consider, how long ago did this thing occur? Is it in fact something which is current? They ask themselves, is the evidence contemporaneous with the events? That is, was the evidence created at the same time the event occurred, or was it created years later? They're looking at, is the evidence valid? And they look at the weight of the evidence. Who has provided it? What is the format of the evidence? They're asking themselves, is the evidence sufficient? Now, if we define the principles of assessment in VET, we look at the first one, fairness. How do we deal with fairness? Well, firstly, no learner may be disadvantaged unless the training package conditions have certain statements. You know, you can have training package conditions in areas of critical care which say that assessment must be done without notice. But other than that, fairness must be there. Whether somebody is tall or short or comes from one country or another, it must be equivalent to for everybody. However, remember this, that to determine whether it's fair, the training package conditions must be looked at. The first one you're going to look at are the assessment conditions. What does the assessment conditions say? Now, for example, at HBA, our assessment conditions are mostly quite benign, but it isn't like that in all industry segments, is it? The next thing you need to look at is the performance evidence. This plays a major role in determining fairness. And lastly, consider the knowledge evidence. So when we combine assessment conditions, performance evidence, and knowledge evidence, what you have is a trio that's non-negotiable. You cannot circumvent those. So fairness may apply as long as it doesn't contradict the things which are rules in the training package. Now let's consider the validity. What does it mean? Well, what it's saying is it must be directly related to that which it is trying to prove. So for example, if you were enrolled to do a training and assessment qualification, I couldn't say to you, if you can run around this block in 5 minutes, I will give you the qualification, because the assessment is simply not valid to that which we're trying to prove. Having said that, we've had people that would like to have that done, I assure you. We look at the next rule, which is flexibility, or next principle, I should say, flexibility. What do we mean by being flexible? Well, you might want to do assessment now, you might want to do assessment later. You might want to commence today, but split it and do some a little bit later. You might say you're going to do it today, but for whatever reason, you now don't want to do it today. This is being flexible as a principle of assessment. And lastly, here we're going to look at reliability. So what does this mean in this context? Well, what it means is whether you in Sydney or myself in Darwin or another person in Timbuktu conduct the assessment outcome must be the same. And so this does require a little bit of extra work from us. Where this gets a little difficult is if you're working with low AQF levels, AQF1, 2, etc., you can easily have multiple choice answers. Is it A, B, C, or D? And to assess, you can simply create a template made out of plastic where you cut out the squares, and if the ticks or crosses appear in the open boxes, then they've got it fine. But once you get to an AQF level 4, you can't do that. And so let us consider a possible question out of training and assessment. What is the name of the National Vet Regulator? What is the role? Sorry, what is their role? What is their authority? What are the limits to what they can tell you to do? And so when you look at that, that takes an amount of research and the creation of an open answer to an open question. Now, herein lies somewhat of an issue for all of us. You see, there's something over 1 million words in the English language. I know it's inconceivable, but something over 1 million. And I'm told we all use, depending on education, you could use anywhere from 25,000 through to 60,000 words. And what that means, there's a lot of words to use. So how you might describe something with words and how I might describe something with words might be quite different, although our meaning may be the same. So in order to deal with this, we wish to promote the concept of moderation. Now, a lot of these ION words get confused. You know, you've got consultation, and you've got moderation, and you've got facilitation. Moderation works like this. We ensure that there is consistency in assessment decisions by grouping together our trainers, whether that's in person or whether that be via a medium, I should say, as we're currently using. And what we will do, we will discuss both knowledge questions and we will discuss the performance activity. And we will determine, okay, if we're looking at knowledge questions and we're looking to assess those, what's the general thing we're looking for? What are the key words which would suggest this person knows what we're asking about? And secondly, if we're looking at the performance activity and you might want somebody to do a presentation or create a resource, when you're looking at that, once again, we moderate this and we look at, okay, what is it we're seeking the person to do? Now remember, moderation should occur ongoing and moderation should be documented and any changes put into your continuous improvement register. Because you as an RTO are required to prove a commitment to continuous improvement. So your continuous improvement register should include the version numbers that you've used, what you've changed and what the new version of it is. Remember, every document in your RTO needs to be looked at often. Another side about moderation is where we have a chat and we ask ourselves the activities or the questions that we've posed to the learners, could they be misinterpreted? If somebody had English as a second other language, could they misinterpret what we want them to do or what the question is asking? So we need to consider that and ensure that everybody can understand. We need to make sure our language is understandable by all. Bearing in mind, you use different words to what I would use to interpret something. Now, if I look at the rules of evidence in VET, the first thing that I go to look at here is authentic. Now, what do we mean by a rule of authentic? Well, I can tell you I have a drawer with multiple HBA qualifications in it. The only problem with that is none of them were issued by HBA. They are, in fact, not right. So let me tell you how these things can occur. A person, and there'll be no names in this, but a person works for a very large organisation that's well known, and that organisation is involved with doing a high level, high risk qualification in huge volumes. It's a first aid qualification. I forget the name of the organisation and the person. And some years ago, the CEO came to me and he said, Harold, I need to check something. I said, what is that? He said, well, we have asked for your RTO to authenticate the qualifications you've issued to our trainers and our assessors, and you've done that for most of them, but there's one that's come up as being not authenticated. And we're concerned about that. We're concerned because this person has done over 3,000 assessments. He said, so I need to know that you're 100% right. So I went into our staff member who looks after such things, and we did the checking, and certainly the qualification was not authentic. I phoned the gentleman back and said, hey, look, I'm sorry, but that's definitely not an authentic qualification. And he said to me, well, what do you think I should do? We have something in excess of 3,000 qualifications that this person has signed off. I said, well, look, perhaps you get a qualified assessor to go through every one of those assessments and do a validation. He said, well, that wouldn't work because the majority of what we do when we're actually assessing first aid is by sight. And we're filling out our instruments as they do the various things like CPR, etc. So he said, in light of that, what do you think we should do? I said to him, I'm in no position to provide any direction to what you should do. That's entirely up to you. I said, as I said, you have two choices. One, go to your regulator and put your hand up and say, I've got this problem. Two, move on in life and hope it never gets audited. I said, but I am not providing any advice in this area because that's not my job. Clearly, what's occurred in your organisation is non-compliant. Now, whatever we did, I have no idea and I have no interest. And like I say, I forget the organisation and I forget the person's name. It was a while ago. So we look at this authentic side and we see other sides to evidence which is not authentic. You know, plagiarism. We're forever looking at work that's submitted by a learner and then finding people from another organisation who've submitted word perfect work as well. And that can't be right. That means one of those documents was not created by the individual. So you ensure, as you're doing your assessments, that the evidence that you have is authentic. Now, the second element here that we look at is current. Now, is evidence current? And this is so tricky. On the one hand, I could say to you, if you provide me evidence that is less than 5 years of age, I will accept that as current evidence. But I ask you this question, could I present you a first aid certificate I did 4 years ago? And on that basis, would it be current? Well, clearly it's not, because there is a life on the first aid qualification. And so it would need to be redone. What about supposing a qualification was superseded 4 years ago and you did it before the supersession? Is that still current? Well, if it has no lifespan, it most certainly could be. I mean, those of you who hold TAE 40116, did you not use your TAE 40110 qualification for the transfer of units of competency to get credit transfer for those you didn't need to do? Clearly you did. We know because we did thousands of them at this end. What about, I learned something formally or informally 10 years ago. Could that be current? Well, I asked the National Regulator that because I used to say no, but an auditor told me that if nothing has changed in that industry segment and you have maintained your professional development, and you need to have that recorded, then it certainly could still be current. Let us move to the next element, valid. If we say that evidence must be valid, what do we mean? Well, it must directly relate to that which we're trying to prove. So, for example, if you were trying to prove to us that you had created a learning program and learned how to do it 10 years ago, and the evidence you submitted was a letter from your next door neighbour saying what a great kid you were as you grew up, I mean, clearly, it's not a valid piece of evidence, is it? And the last element I touch on here is sufficient. Now, this is an interesting element. Let's think about the word sufficient. What's another word for sufficient? If your mind said enough, then you're pretty spot on. So how do we know whether evidence is sufficient? Well, if the unit of competency says you need to do something twice, then if you've done it twice and it is found to be satisfactory, then it's sufficient. If it says you need to do 5 validations, well, if you've done 5 and they are in fact found to be satisfactory, then it's sufficient. But you see, let's move on to a recognition of prior learning claim. Now, I'm not going to go into RPL here because that's another session. But if we're calling for evidence and you provide us evidence, and as an assessor, I find the evidence is not compelling, I say to you, I would like you to submit some more evidence. And you then submit some more evidence. And I say to you, I still need more supplementary evidence. And you can say to me, but I've given you 8 pieces, that's got to be sufficient. I would say to you, it's sufficient when I say it's sufficient. I will say it's sufficient when I'm comfortable that I can make an assessment decision. And if you force me to make an assessment decision, there's only one decision I will make for you, and that will be not competent. Because I'm not going to say yes when I should have said no. As an assessor, never be pressured into making an assessment decision. Never let anybody pressure you. If they do, you only have one answer. Now, if we look at the National Vet Regulator, many of you are not under the National Vet Regulator, you're under, those of you in West Australia and in Victoria have your own regulator. But you do adopt the same principles as the National Vet Regulator. Let's look at some of the requirements which are stated as being required. The first thing, the regulators want to see that you have a strong professional development record. You need to be able to prove two things. Firstly, we know that competence is at its highest level at the moment you are found competent. From that moment on, it wanes because we're minds, our mind loses things. And so what you have to do is at least maintain that level of competence. But the second element here is you and I both know there are changes which are coming in all the time. They can be technology changes, they can be methods that change. And to that extent, your PD must show that you are a better trainer and assessor now than you were when you got the qualification. You see, the most highly awarded members of our society, doctors, the PhDs, engineers, accountants, dentists, these people are required to do professional development. They must accumulate so many points each year, and doing different things acquires different numbers of points for them. The second thing which the regulators all require from us is to review our documentation. Now, as an RTO, we are required to review our documentation every 12 months. Now, remember, you keep a version control register and you enter into there, even if there's no changes, that you reviewed document whatever, version 2.1, and there are no changes required, or there are changes required. So you're required to maintain that. That proves your commitment to continuous improvement. They require that only those that have earned qualifications actually get qualifications. And one of the worst things that you, as an assessor, can ever do is say yes. Now, I say this to many thousands of people over the years. You'll never get into trouble for saying no when you should have said yes in assessment. But if you say yes when you should have said no, and somebody gets hurt or worse, then I'm afraid you deserve the full weight of the law to go against you. The next thing that the regulators require from us is that we follow both training package rules and the standards for RTOs. Now, sometimes I'm quite aghast when we're looking particularly at the gap training to go from 1.0 through to 40116, and we have a chat, a competency chat to people that are applying. And if you talk to these people about what are the standards for RTOs, not all of them, many of them, more than you could imagine, do not know. They've never read the standards for RTOs. Now, you're required to know what they are, and they're freely available. Just going onto the asper.gov.au website, we'll find you to them. They've got it listed there. And the training package rules, remember these things you follow. If you don't follow those, then you are just issued a qualification to somebody who you shouldn't have done that. Now, if you've been in audit, and I'm sure many of you have been in audit, and I can tell you I've had 5 audits and I haven't enjoyed one of them, but the regulator has some wonderful questions. Here's one of them. How have you determined the volume of learning? Now, if your answer is anything but it's related to the Australian qualification framework, they will not let you through. But one of the actual best questions, and this stumps many RTOs, how have you ensured that the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment have been followed in assessment? Now, that's a tough question. You know, if you consider all the things in vet, I can think of only 2 things which have not changed over all the years that we've been involved. The first are the rules of evidence. They've not changed. And the second is the principles of assessment. The qualifications have changed, the units have changed, and the requirements for trainers and assessors, they've changed. So how have you ensured the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment have been followed in assessment? I mean, we all want to be compliant because we know it's the only thing that can take us down. We all have competitors, and that's fine. That makes this an interesting country, and it makes you smart in the mind, trying to out-strategize your competitor. We want to be compliant. So let's look at the complex issue of how do I ensure that the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment have been followed. Well, to do this, I want to first look at a particular unit. TAE DEL 401, plan, organise and deliver group-based learning. Now, this is that terrible unit where everybody has to do presentations of a minimum 40 minutes, and that'd be 2 consecutive presentations. And let us have a look at this to start with. Let's look at the assessment conditions. So when we look at the assessment conditions for this unit, you'll see that these are benign. But you know, all assessment conditions aren't benign. I'll tell you a true story of a course I ran some years ago. And just as you would do, I had 12 to 15 people in that course, TA course, and I get them initially to introduce themselves. And we went around the room, who are you, why are you here? And a gentleman stood up, he said, gave us his name, he said, I'm here because I haven't slept for 5 months. I'm out the front incredulously going, you haven't slept for 5 months? That couldn't be so. He said, yeah, it is. I said, why? He said, well, I work in the mining industry. He said, and what's not generally known, where I work in mining, we don't all sit on bulldozers and tractors. We actually have remote control devices on many of those. And there's a training course on how to use the remote control on this equipment. He said, I've been with the man for 3 days. And we've been going through the processes, and we're at the final stage of assessment. He said, I'm standing 10 metres to the side of the man. He has the remote control unit in his hand. All he has to do is to bring this giant bulldozer, which is called a Caterpillar D9, this giant bulldozer up and stop it 10 metres in front of him. And he is standing 1 metre in front of a coalface. He said, I have filled out the assessment instrument. I'm just getting ready to sign it. He said, I watched the bulldozer go past the 10-metre line. I watched the bulldozer go to the man without slowing down. I watched the blade of this bulldozer pushing up against the wall. I heard this scream. I saw this squirting of blood. And the man was dead. He said, every time I close my eyes, I relive the experience. I see what's happening. I hear what happened. He said, I can't sleep, but they've told me that I have to come and do this course. Now, I don't know whether you know, prior to this incident, the mines were a very powerful lobby group in this country. And they said to government, you will use our qualifications. They're far more arduous than your qualifications. This was the incident that caused the federal government to say, mines, if you do not adopt our nationally recognised qualifications, then we will close you down. I can tell you, for the ensuing 15 months, I had trainers flying to places you've never heard of in this country, running work health safety and running training and assessment courses for miners. So let us go back to our elements. We're going to look now at fairness. How do we assure that what we are doing in a unit is fair? Well, consider this. What do you think fairness means in assessment in vocational education and training? Just consider that for a few seconds. Well, fairness means that you may not be disadvantaged, as I've said before, unless the training package rules say that assessment must be done in a certain way. You know, when I'm assessing somebody, for example, that might have dyslexia, to help them, I might modify my resources and use dyslexia. Now, if any of your good selves are dyslexic, what you see on the screen, you would be able to read much easier than if we had straight type there at the moment. You might find we have learners who English as a second other language. And so for the purpose of assessment, we might get them to slow right down when they're trying to speak to us and or if they're trying to write. We could determine that their English is at such a level that they cannot fulfill the requirements of our unit. Therefore, under the heading of fairness, we would send them to some sort of speech therapist, somebody who could improve their English, and then bring them back and we'll conduct the assessment for them. Now remember this, all of you, that these things which are variable, they must be reflected in two places. Firstly, your training and assessment strategy must reflect what you're doing. And that's why you need to review it every 12 months. And secondly, your assessment tools must also reflect what it is you want the learner to do and how you will be applying this particular element. Let's consider the element of validity. Now, if we look back at our DEL 401 unit, and we see that some of the performance criteria says that you have to develop session plans, learning programs, and you need to monitor and document process. So what we have here is a very tight group of requirements. If we combine that performance criteria with both the performance evidence and the knowledge evidence, then what we see is if we follow this, then what we have must be valid. Now, if we look at the first dot point under performance evidence, we can see it says you need to do 2 consecutive sessions and you have to have at least 8 individuals in the audience. So supposing I'm doing the presentation and I'm absolutely perfect in the presentations, followed it all, have my learning programs, my session plan, etc., and I have 7 people in the audience. Is this valid? The answer is it is not, because the performance evidence, which is a rule in the training package, it overrules the fact that I can get away with 7. The third principle I want to talk about is flexibility. How do we ensure flexibility is in our assessment process? Well, let's define flexibility. If you're doing that unit DEL 401, you can do your presentations today. You can do one today and one at another time. You don't have to do any today. You can do them at another time. You can start, oh, you now feel sick? Hey, stop. We can move those along to another time. You see, this is flexibility in assessment. And remember, you need to build flexibility in. We look at this and we go, you can do it here, you can do it there. Lastly, let us consider reliability. Now, we've covered off reliability previously, but how do I prove the veracity of it? How do I prove the veracity of evidence? Well, in order to have this thing, reliability, we need to have certain resources available. We need to have mapping documents where we map the assessment tasks against the units of competency. We need to have an assessor's guide. And in that assessor's guide, it should have instructions for the assessor. Tell that assessor what they need to do. There should also be in there some instructions for the learner. We provide the assessor with model answers. Bearing in mind, we've all got different language, but we provide model answers. This is what we're looking for in this question. And lastly, moderation. I can't say enough how much you should conduct moderation and document it. It's very important to ensure that what you're doing is right. Now, the next element I want to touch on is called reasonable adjustment. Oh, what is reasonable adjustment? Is it me saying, hey, it's okay, you're a good mate, I'll sign you off on this? No, sometimes we're allowed to exercise reasonable adjustment, just sometimes. But in exercising this, there is an immovable caveat, and that is you cannot change the training package rules. You cannot change them. But we look at things, we could have somebody that's displayed a terrific holistic understanding of what it is we're assessing. And we know when we're marking, we only have 4 marks. It's satisfactory or not satisfactory if it's part of a unit of competency, or it's competent or not competent if it's a whole unit. They used to have not yet competent, which prescribed hope for the future. But a couple of years ago, they took the word yet out of it. Now, if we look at reasonable adjustment, it could be that the English and the grammar is terrible, but they understand what we're doing. It could be that whilst we find there's additional words there to what we want, it's not quite what we want. Now, the reality of life is COVID-19 has affected us all. In Delivery 401, we used to have to assess in person. But they've now allowed, being the National Vet Regulator, they've now allowed for assessment to occur online in such things as presentations. We still have to follow the training package rules of having 8 people there. You take Cricos RTOs, and I feel for you guys with no international students. We used to have 2 in this building, now the floors are empty. That you're now allowed to deliver by distance delivery to learners who have an Australian visa. But remember, whether you have got this reasonable adjustment or not, you must have that built into your training assessment strategy, because the regulators want to look and say, are you following the training assessment strategy which we approved? Now, before we move on to one last thing, I'd like to introduce you to a Kahoot competition. If you go to kahoot.it, it's more a quiz, kahoot.it, it was me. So, now, I used to be on the international speaking circuit. And when talking to groups, I used to tell them in conclusion a short story, which I'd like to share with you. A Pulitzer Prize winner wrote years ago, in South Africa, they dig for diamonds. Men don small helmets with a little light, often lit with just a candle. And in their hand, they go down into these holes, which are often only held up by pieces of wood. And they get to the bottom of this and they chip away with this little pick, and they're looking for diamonds. And in case you don't know, everybody, the fine rate of a diamond is 1 part in 3 million. He went on to say, and every now and then, the walls or the roof cave in, and his mates have to pull him out. They have to dig away. And he's in there moving all these thousands of tons of useless, worthless rock, rubble, and dirt. But what they're looking for is they're looking for this small, tiny gemstone. And these gemstones are so rare that when they find them, they're so valuable that it makes all the moving and sifting of the useless rock, rubble, and dirt worthwhile. Now, I say to you, as an older person, that life and vocational education and training is no different than digging for diamonds. You're going to move thousands of tons of useless, worthless rock, rubble, and dirt. But every now and then, you're going to find a diamond. And when you do, stop, hold it, look at it, love it. And then you find that that makes moving all of that useless, worthless rock, rubble, and dirt okay. Thank you for coming to HBA. If those of you who are going to attend the next session, it will be on the stated date, and when that's on, we will issue another date which will have another subject on it. We have received a few recommendations for subjects. If you have anything you would like to see professional development session on, just send it to Carol or myself. You've got our email addresses, and we'd be happy to help you. Thank you very much for your time today, and have a lovely weekend. Thank you.